and I'm a member of the research subcommittee of the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education. This particular group is an independent network of leaders in counsellor education in Australia. We've also got our chair of the subcommittee, Katrina Andrews. So welcome, Katrina. She's sitting with us tonight. I'd like to welcome the National Heads Network. Anyone else who's from the National Heads tonight? Also, any of the leadership from the Australian counselling profession who might be joining us, as well as any other Australian UK guests and academics and researchers and that who might also be joining us as well. So welcome to everybody who's online and also to those watching on YouTube. So I'd just like to take a few minutes just to provide some context for this event. So in 2023, the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education set up a research subcommittee to address concerns we had about unclear pathways for students progressing to higher education research training, and a general perception that research and research preparation may not be given sufficient attention, specifically in counsellor education, but also more widely in the profession. In fact, some Australian research has suggested that students and practitioners associate research with the profession of psychology and not counselling. So they see that as a distinguishing difference between psychology and counselling, is that they research, we don't. While a desktop review we published recently found that 46% of accredited counselling qualifications did not contain any named research subjects. In a research paper I'm preparing at the moment, looking at all the counsellor educators in Australia, the counselling educators without counselling qualifications, so those who have got psychology qualifications or social work or other cognate sort of qualifications, they averaged 23 publications for those, and these are people who are counselling educators, but they have different qualifications. While those counselling educators with counselling qualifications average 5, so 1/5 of the productivity of the cognate professionals. Now, if I take out the top 2 researchers, this average drops to a little over 3 per research. And I'm not talking about 3 per year. I'm talking about 3 over the entire span of their career, okay, on average. So it's pretty low. 2/3 of counselling qualified academics have no publications at all, whereas for those educators without counselling qualifications, they only have 1/3 have no publications. Okay, so we're double the proportion of people with no publications in the scholarly community. Scholarly production by counsellor trained academics is comparatively low in comparison to our colleagues from cognate disciplines. Now, on a positive note, our 2 peak bodies have shown a commitment to research in terms of research committees that they host, funding and hosting of peer-reviewed research journals, funding research projects, holding research streams in their conferences and other ways as well. So in spite of this support from the profession, we believe more is needed to strengthen a research culture in counsellor education and the profession more broadly in Australia. So our research subcommittee has been looking at various strategies to help increase research capacity as a profession. As part of this, we've been looking at how other jurisdictions have been addressing the question of how to strengthen research culture and capacity. Now, I came across some articles from UK scholars, including Mick Cooper, who were describing issues and strategies from the UK context. I've also been really impressed when looking at the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy website and what they report they are doing. So from this context, I reached out to Mick Cooper to ask if he would speak to some leaders in Australian counselling about the UK context and approach to building research culture and capacity in their profession over there. So he's graciously agreed to provide his insights. Now, for those who don't know Mick, Professor Mick Cooper is a professor of counselling psychology at the University of Roehampton. He's written scholarly articles discussing research and also has a book called Essential Research Findings in Counselling and Psychotherapy. On his own personal website blog, he has a section of blogs devoted to assistance with research. So for counselling researchers or students can go research and in various different areas of interest. So it looks like a really useful resource. So for tonight, I've prepared some questions for Mick relating to tonight's topic, which is around, the experience of research in the UK context in counselling in their profession over there. And so I've got some questions and I will open it to the floor for some other questions. But first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Mick Cooper this event tonight, to this Q&A session that we're holding. So thank you,
Thanks,
Mick, for joining us.
thanks, Nathan, and I'm pleased to say I finally got my computer working. Just to say, we also have from the UK, so we got Nicola Blunden, who works for the Professional Association BACP. So it's great to have Nicola along, and then we got Professor Terry Hanley from the University of Manchester, who's been very involved in these discussions as well. So I think that's everyone from the UK, but I think between the three of us, we should be able to give you a bit of perspective on what's been happening in the UK and some of the current debates. I've also put for colleagues the couple of papers. So the first one was led by Michael Barkham. I put in the chat, which was in the BACP Therapy Today, kind of calling on more research awareness in the profession, and then one that was more specifically about training. So people are very welcome to have a look at those and draw on them. But yeah, let's go ahead and hopefully Terry, Nicola, and I can help say something about what's been going on in the UK.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm just curious then, team, is in terms of can you tell some of the history of the discourse of research in the UK, sort of the conversations that's been happening up until this point, and some of the issues and struggles that you may have faced or experienced over there?
Yeah, let me start, and then maybe Nicola and Terry can fill in some more. So I think that, I mean, it's always been an area of tension, and it's been an ongoing process. The person who's really been at the forefront, unfortunately, couldn't join us, is John McLeod, who was involved in the counselling field for many years, and I know he's been over to Australia and done and has a lot of interest in what's happening in Australia. I think back in probably the 90s, I think it was, he developed this journal, Counselling and Psychotherapy Research, and also established a regular research conference for the BACP, which is really popular now, and has a really good turnout each year. But I think that um, there's always been a tension, I guess, between a kind of level of research activity where some academics, and then you were saying, Nathan, about, it's a fairly marginal activity, and I think that's also true to say in the UK, that it's not a lot of academics and trainers in counselling in the UK wouldn't be doing research, and a lot of research activities tends to sit on the peripheries of training and development in the counselling field. I mean, it's very different from, people probably know, we had the Improving Access Psychological Therapies program, which was a government initiated program of interventions mainly based around CBT, which was very, very driven by a particular evidence base around CBT. But that really sat outside counselling. And whereas 20, 30 years ago, we had counselling was the major activity in primary care, in doctors' surgeries, for instance. Over the last, I guess, since about 2006, that's really been supplanted by CBT and what's called now NHS talking therapies a lot, because of this very evidence-based driven approach, which the government is keen on and understands. So where counselling has research has been more on the peripheries of counselling. There's been a lot of, for instance, also ethnographic research, small-scale qualitative research. Students on some programs master's programs and doctoral programs will do more research. But I think where Michael Barkham and myself and others were writing from was a concern that it was really at the peripheries of the profession, and the research was done often as a kind of way of practicing skills in inquiry, often very aligned with person-centered and phenomenological practices, which is great in many ways. But there wasn't an integration between what was being learned and focused on in the research and the kinds of questions being asked, and then really what was being practiced. So you'd have studies, for instance, looking at maybe therapists' experiences of self-reflexivity during training, which as a reflexive study is an important piece of work and is of a lot of value. But in terms of then having implications for what therapists might deliver or what training might look like, it was very much still grounded in the particular models of primarily person-centered or integrative or psychodynamic practice. So those kind of remained untouched by the research activity. And I think we felt that in the UK, a lot of it is that, well, going back to what you're saying, really, is that most trainers in the field are not active researchers or actively involved in the research field. So it's not just that they're not actively researching themselves, and I think these are two slightly separate issues, but also that they wouldn't have a in-depth knowledge necessarily of what the research evidence currently says about the state of counselling and psychotherapy in the UK. So that's just some kind of brief introduction comment. I don't know if Nicola or Terry want to add anything to that about the kind of UK picture and the history.
Nicola, do you want to add something first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something about regulation here as well, in that we're, in the UK, we're not a regulated profession. That means that there isn't any kind of mandated requirement, and it's really down to professional bodies, of which there are many, that kind of hold professionals to set standards. And I'm in professional standards department in the BACP. We also have an entire research department that's headed with my colleague Claire Simmons, which is fantastic. And there's a real commitment at the BACP for practitioners to be research informed, research literate, research capable. And we're also in tension with institutions, universities, that, research is very expensive to teach. It's very high resource. It usually requires a lot of one-to-one support. And there's a kind of an initial hurdle of anxiety for students to kind of transition to becoming research capable when they're really still grappling with being novice practitioners. So there's an awful lot of kind of pressures coming back, I think, at us in the profession that we're kind of pushing the tide away from as well. But as someone who's taught a lot of students doing research, the satisfaction of doing research and the depth that it can add to your practice is huge too. And I think partly it's about us holding that line, as professionals, that we do see it as important, that we do invite more and more of the membership to participate in research. But there are a lot of systemic challenges, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to repeat kind of the kind of practitioner side. I think kind of, what Mick and Nicola have sort of reflected is certainly my experience, that it was historically a bit of the poisoned chalice. I think, if you were the lecturer that was introducing research skills, it was, you weren't the one who was introducing people to what they were sitting in that chair to sort of learn, whether or not it was person-centered therapy or whatever it is. And, it felt like there was a real trying to win hearts and minds kind of in that process. And I think Mick's work and kind of BACP's work has done a huge sort of sea change. Well, maybe not a huge. It's starting to sort of move in a way where I think people are seeing the value of research.
What's your sound? You're back again.
Oh, did I disappear?
Yeah, that's okay.
I'll speak a bit close to this. Sorry about that. The bit I wanted to add, I suppose, was thinking about the context. So Nathan, it was interesting hearing your overview of kind of, academics in Australia. And I think while the picture's slightly different in the UK, I think there's a lot of academics in the UK still aren't very engaged in research. I wouldn't imagine you would sort of get many of us who are kind of have published similar amounts as your higher kind of level within Australia. And within we have this the Research Excellence Framework, which I think you have in Australia in a similar format. Kind of, there aren't many academics in the UK who are entered into that kind of context. And I think Nicola mentioned the idea of the systemic challenges that we have here. I think lots of institutions that maybe counselling is sort of offered don't have the resources and the support for researchers. So whilst it almost sounds, when I listen to you give your introduction, it almost felt like, well, we problematized the academics. And actually, I think there's a big challenge in that sense of, well, how do we get the institutions to support people in doing this type of research as well, whether or not that's funding or time, etc. But that was the bit I would add there.
Yeah. So some of the things I'm picking up from all three of you is there's really, in some sense, there's the society is saying we value certain types of research and practice, and we're going to get behind that. And counselling's philosophies at times can be, and our approach to research and our methods can be somewhat different or value different things to what government funding bodies are looking for. And obviously that'll favour other cognate professions which are actually delivering and giving them what they're wanting. Plus there is that, and this is something, and I think it's the same in Australia as well. And another similarity, I think, with Nicola talking is students are coming into the field to learn practice. They're not signing up for research, they're signing up for practice. So they don't have that expectation. And if they're exposed to staff who also are not very familiar with research or not even comfortable with it because of the connotations of research, which tends to be linked with the psychology, objectivism, and the rats and stats sort of thing. There can also be that sort of caution around that from the academic side, and even people within the profession as well. So there is some level of quite a lot of, and I believe these issues we're talking about, the culture and all that, and I guess the ambivalence towards it, is I think an international thing. It seems like people are attracted to counselling, are very much attracted to relationship more so than rats and stats. So we've got this, almost geared away from the understanding the benefit and value of research. Would that be a fair sort of conclusion? Or?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent summary, Nathan, and is very accurate. I think just the one bit I'd add to that, and apology, this becomes a bit of a rant, but I think one of the problems in the counselling field is that we're often very rooted in particular modalities. And I think, for instance, I come from a person-centered and existential background. Person-centered is very popular in the UK, psychodynamic. But often when students learn about the person-centered approach, what they'll learn is Rogers's 1957 propositions as the basis. And I think where trainers are very committed to, say, those 1957 propositions as the basis for practice, as a kind of truth statement about what is necessary and sufficient for change, or particular models of psychodynamic therapy. Research knowledge really doesn't have a meaningful role because, if Roger said this in 1957, then why would you want to do research? Research at the very best will be around the peripheries, maybe trying to show that what Roger said is true, or maybe look at how that is for therapists or practitioners to learn that. But there isn't a genuine engagement with research because there isn't a genuine belief that research is going to tell us anything that we don't know. So I think for me, the issue of taking research seriously, and I think it is useful to distinguish between research knowledge and research as a kind of practice. And I think there's there's a massive body of research knowledge out there from psychotherapy researchers and across the field. But I think to take that seriously means to take I think one has to have a particularly flexible, open-minded approach to what it means to practice as a counsellor. One which, not to say one shouldn't have a model, but there needs to be a certain openness, flexibility, willingness to learn, grow, kind of areas of recognizing the limits of one's knowledge. In contrast to a kind of almost zealous religious-like dedication to a particular model. I think, we do have that in the field around a range of different models, and where people have that kind of zealousness about a particular model, I think research is always going to play a very tertiary role in informing practice. And then if you have practitioners who have that zealotry, and students come out of courses with that zealotry, that I don't think there's any chance for research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in the UK, there appears to be some people who have, or some movements to try and enhance research and embed it more into the culture, at least an openness to it, maybe research literacy in that. What sort of things have people done or groups done that's tried to encourage or enhance the capacity of research in the UK or literacy of the research?
Well, it's interesting what Terry was saying, and it sounds like maybe Terry's a bit more optimistic than I am. I think that I am not sure the dial's particularly shifted. I think certainly there was these couple of articles from Michael Barker and myself. I think Nicola was saying the BACP research department has been very active. They funded a big trial a few years ago, looking at counselling and comparing it with CBT. They have the research conference, which has been very active. I think there's been we're going through this process called Scoped, and maybe Nicola can say a bit more about this, which is a UK-wide regulation process for counselling. And there is some inclusion of research competencies in research criteria in Scope. But personally, I think it's still very much at the margins and isn't kind of integrated in a serious way necessarily into the competencies across the different levels of the profession. So I think there's maybe been more discussion whether there is actually a meaningful change, and anything's brought around a meaningful change. I'm not sure. Terry, what do you think? Do you think things have meaningfully changed?
You put me as the optimist in this sort of thing. From 20 years ago, yes. I think that people seem to be talking about research a lot more and sort of have it on the agenda. I think I can see it sort of people using it to inform knowledge around new topics, thinking about online therapies or kind of digital technologies, and thinking about climate anxiety, decolonizing curricula, and those sort of topics. I sort of see that people are using it on that periphery. Less so necessary, when we talk about routine outcome measures. And, I know Michael, when he wrote that paper or pulled that paper together, was very keen to sort of try and increase some of the discussions about how it informs almost day-to-day work. I think probably I see less of a movement in that particular area, but starting to sort of chip away at kind of or inform practitioners about new horizons, I suppose, is an area I think is helpfully moving.
It sounds almost like it's around the safer topics, because it's a little bit threatening when you're looking at your own outcomes and compared to.
I think there is a bit of that, and it's kind of there's that. What is the science that is useful for counselling? I suppose if we start taking, you mentioned psychology and kind of particularly that kind of positivist sort of perspective, it doesn't fit with a lot of psychological theories, and I think sometimes people don't see the synergy between the different worlds. And Mick's been doing some really interesting stuff where you're trying to bridge kind of that more positivistic and maybe ideographic kind of different perspectives, which seems in keeping with even the way Rogers was working in the 40s. He was a scientist. You read his 42 book, half that book is a transcript with Herbert Bryan that he sort of did because it was he wanted to understand the practice more. So he scrutinized his work in a systematic way, and he went on to do some simplistic trial sort of work, but he was experimenting with these sort of works of sort of research approaches, and people sort of are selective in their histories of kind of how these sort of models sort of evolved in some ways. And I think we sort of need to get something that seems to fit with what we do, rather than necessarily saying, well, we need to be like those positivistic psychologists that publish in these high impact journals. We don't. We need to find something that fits with sort of our philosophies and our ways of working.
And suppose you do, will your educational institute support that in terms of promotion, or is that a different conversation altogether, almost?
Oh, well, I don't want to take too much time. I'm sure others have perspectives on this as well. I think it depends on the institution. I'm involved in reviewing for a number of institutions across the UK, and I can see, like my institution that's very research intensive, values what I do. It finds it hard sometimes to sort of work out where we situate it. I'm in an education department, and so it's kind of, does my research talk to an educational kind of context, or if you try and move it across faculty, it becomes incredibly difficult because I suppose it's sort of starting to talk a different language. In other institutions, I think we fit more within kind of social care or psychology neatly, dependent on the academics and their focus, the way their research is directed. But I think it's something we always have to have in our agenda is, well, who is paying our bills and kind of, so therefore, what does our research have to look like in some ways?
Yeah, so sort of manage the bridge, integrating with our own philosophy and our own, things that really whet our appetites, as well as how do we manage the people who are paying us and their expectations, and to play the game, so to speak. So, yeah.
Oh, carry on, Terry. Carry on.
No, I could talk about that for a long time. So you go in, Nicola.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's a kind of identity problem for a lot of counsellors, which is we don't know where we sit. We don't know where we sit in the wider social sphere. Do we sit in education? Do we sit in health? Do we sit in social care? Do we sit in philosophy? And I think that what happens is you see that played out in these various systemic issues. So you don't know what ref submission, what research excellence framework submission you're going into, which panel is going to, see your work. And then if we're thinking about evidence-based practice, which is a very health and social care oriented kind of paradigm, then we need the evidence to do evidence-based practice. So who generates that evidence? If it's people from other professions, how can we be sure that it has kind of integrity with what counsellors do? So that means counsellors need to do it, right? So we need to produce that evidence. But a lot of counsellors see themselves as sitting outside of that medical model, health and social care model, quite deliberately, even though Rogers was saying, Rogers was into the facts, and Mick has repurposed his quote, "The facts are friendly," for his book. And we know that research should be in the DNA really of what we're doing, but where does it sit? What paradigm does it sit in? I think that tension is part of the reason that we see these things played out in a more kind of granular level. And I'm not sure that there's a solution to that, other than the point that Mick was making about we need to be flexible. We need to maybe sit in multiple paradigms. We need to sit across paradigms somehow. And particularly if we're thinking about decolonizing counselling and psychotherapy, which I think is, overdue now, we really need to start dismantling some of the assumptions that we've carried in from a kind of industrial, Western, white perspective. We might not sit in any modality that currently sits in academia. There might be something, more transgressive even than that. So then how are we going to research inform that practice? How are we going to develop evidence there? So I think it's a kind of soul searching for us as a profession, really, about what we think our role is in society and what our identity is. And that's such a huge thing to do when so many of us are so different and coming from so many different perspectives. So there's no solution there, but perhaps that's why we see these silos springing up.
It's one of those challenges, I think, in the counselling profession, because we've typically been a profession which congregated together from a whole lot of people from different diverse backgrounds who've come together. So diversity is one of our almost part in our DNA, individual diversity, which means that the whole where we sit in multiple areas. So yeah, totally agree with you, Nicola. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the challenges is that, going back to what we were saying about REF, is that from a university's perspective, the studies that tend to get the best ratings, not always, but tend to get the best ratings of REF, are most likely to get funded, are big randomized controlled trials. And, Nathan, you were using the term RAPS and stats, and, and certainly research can be many, many other things. And as Nicola was saying about decolonization, it can be idiographic, but it's those big, normative, large-scale studies that are the ones that tend to get the funding, tend to have the highest impact, tend to be taken most seriously by the government. So there's constant pressure to kind of be involved at that level. And, as somebody who's been involved and led, we did a big trial of person-centered school counselling. I think what we learned from that is actually it wasn't the end of the world. We weren't selling our soul to the devil to be involved in something like that. We used it as a frame. I mean, it was very interesting to do something controlled and to look at the effects of counselling against people who didn't have counselling. We just published a very, very large scale qualitative study where we interviewed 50 of the young people, which we wouldn't have really been able to do if we hadn't done a kind of large scale randomized controlled trial and got kind of £800,000 or so funding to do that. So I think that, those areas, and also the statistics area. I mean, high level stats is not, it's not just about doing stats, it's about doing high level stats for the higher journals is often what they like and prefer. And having people in our field, in the counselling field, who are interested and willing to do that, it is really is a real challenge, but I think is really important. And there's people we collaborate with, statisticians, health economists. We've worked on kind of building those relationships. Some of the people we've worked with at Terry's University, at University of Manchester, it's kind of collaborating across disciplines. But I think a willingness to do that has been really important in building up a kind of research profile. Because one thing that I learned, I mean, a real sea change for me was I did a study about 14, 15 years ago where I talked to many of the leading people in the field. And I think up to that point, I thought, well, surely at some point people are going to realize that qualitative autoethnographic research is really the way to go, and that people will understand that ultimately it's going to be about meaning in people's experiences rather than big randomized controlled trials. And what I learned from that, talking to some, really key people, is actually that's not going to happen. That actually, if anything, things are going to move more towards more controlled, randomized controlled trials, larger data. I mean, a big thing at the moment is these massive data sets that people can now process, much of which is going to be quantitative data. And that, we can either sit around and wait for things to shift, but there's no reason to assume that it's going to shift in this qualitative direction. I think developing our skills, developing our knowledge of these methods is really important. But as everybody's saying, people don't come into the counselling field to do rat stats and experimental trials. Nobody particularly wants to do that. In the UK, nobody particularly wants to do that. Unfortunately, there's only a few kind of nerdy people like myself who are willing to kind of say, right, I want to spend 3 years, 5 years doing a randomized controlled trial. But someone's got to kind of do it, I think.
Yeah.
We need more nerds.
Yeah, you see the utility in doing this, and being able to do different non-traditional research in the counselling world, but it may not necessarily be everybody who does it, but key people, supporting those key people who might be in the field who are a bit nerdy and sort of able to got those skills.
Somebody's got to, somebody's got to do the traditional research, I think. Somebody's got to do it, or at least there's a real risk if nobody wants to do it, but there's a real risk if we don't do that. There's a real risk for approaches like integrative approaches, person-centered approaches, where you've got people in the CBT field and the third wave CBT field, day on day, developing, producing evidence for their approaches because they sit alongside more happy to do stuff. And there's some great people over in Perth. People like Warren Mansell, who, for instance, he's a psychotherapist and does research, and they produce great work. But if in fields like integrative, person-centered, psychodynamic, people aren't willing to do it, that evidence base just isn't going to be generated. There isn't a body of psychologists sitting out there thinking, "Oh, I'd love to do a randomized trial of integrative psychotherapy." It needs people from the integrative or the creative play therapy approach. And you get these approaches. I mean, you get pockets like music therapy, where you've had people, I think it's Christian Gold, or you get play therapy, people like D. Ray, who's, comes from a very person-centered play therapy basis, D. Ray at University of North Texas. But they have a tradition of being involved in randomized trials, and they've developed this amazing evidence base for person-centered play therapy. But then you have other areas where just nobody wants to do randomized trials, and it doesn't have an evidence base.
I might just open it to the floor now in terms of if anyone's got any questions. Any of the other Australian people got any questions of any of the panel here? Anything that you've had on your mind as you've been listening and just wondering about?
Maybe I could add something Mick said while people have a think, because I have a slightly different sort of take, in a sense. I think that RCTs are clearly very influential, and I think it does need sort of groups of people to be engaged in that type of research. I think there's another side where I think there's sort of, we sometimes see the qualitative work as our strength, and actually sometimes when you kind of review the quality of the qualitative research that we're doing, it's not always as strong as it could be. And I've seen kind of within sort of our ref assessments that actually sometimes it's not the quantitative is often research is often rated higher because when it's done at a very high quality. I think the assessment through our universities, it doesn't exempt qualitative research from being rated at the very highest, world leading research and having a change. But sometimes it just doesn't quite meet that mark. And I think that's another part of the story is I think kind of, all methodologies are very valid in terms of this context, but we need to have the individuals who can do them well and kind of train others to do them well as well, which is often part of the difficulty in the UK.
And that's one of the challenges is that have we got people who are able to prepare the next generation, inspire them, enthuse them, and train them good quality training, and then they become the next generation. So it's that there's a whole sense of how to ensure that even the training, there's enough research training in there so that people can have that opportunity to go on into further research. But if they don't have it, then they don't know what they're missing in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that.
Go on, Mick.
Sorry, Nathan. I was just going to say, I think that's a really important point that Terry's making, and maybe it's less about people having kind of quant or stats or RCT skills and just whatever methodology, having that knowledge and at the highest level. It's right that really rigorous qualitative studies can be rated very highly, that they can get funded, they can be taken seriously. But again, it's taking a method like, for instance, reflexive thematic analysis or IPA, and really, really having the rigor to know that method inside out and to be at the leading edge of that method. So it's something about that kind of systematic knowledge and the detail that is really important and is really important to develop. And I think, again, that does run a little bit against where people come into counselling from often, because people like more of the kind of maybe the flexibility, the personality, the relationality. I think even knowing those kind of methods really well, you still need to be a bit nerdy to really be a kind of somebody who knows, something like reflexive thematic analysis inside out and can write an RTA paper at an international publishable level.
Now, in terms of the each of you, what would you sort of say has either been the most influential strategic approach that the UK has done to support research and build capacity, or that you would like it to do, that you think needs to happen, take it higher to increase the capacity and the across the profession, to take it from the fringes, so to speak, more into the centre, closer in that direction?
Right. I'm in terms of there is no centralized strategy here as well. I think that's important to say. It's people like Mick and Terry and others pushing and bringing research back to the forefront and carrying out that research, and we should be grateful for that as practitioners. Really speaking as a practitioner, thank goodness. The work that was done that Mick's team did with schools. Actually, that's had quite high impact. So one of the findings of that was that young people feel very uncomfortable with silence and very exposed, and sometimes feel feelings of shame in silence. And silence was practiced a lot with young people. And I've seen that finding ripple out across the profession with people that don't usually use research. It's something that really caught people's attention, and they're thinking more about how can we make sure that silences are helpful? How can we make sure that we fill silences if that's helpful? Which is kind of a 180 turn on maybe what their practice was like before. So sometimes these very impactful things come from one place. But what I'd like to see strategically is people working more collaboratively together. So we think about thematic analysis, for example. Why aren't we working with specialists in thematic analysis that are in other fields? Why aren't we employing relationships with research specialists that can help us? And why aren't we pooling resources in modalities rather than being in competition as modalities, because I think there's so much scarcity. When you're wedded to a very particular way of doing things, then actually we just reduce that availability for everybody. So I'd like to see more working together, more interdisciplinarity, and more working across modalities. But I don't know who would be the people who would strategize that and create that. It would have to be at a ground roots level, I think.
It almost seems like you're saying that we need to work research, and being smarter means, accessing the experts and cross collaboration and that, rather than just trying to do it individually ourselves and having lower quality research. Actually working smarter to get better quality outcomes, and it doesn't necessarily be the whole profession, but just key individuals who might be in there doing that. Is that sort of?
Yeah, and I think actually, the requirement for people in the UK to get the highest status of counselling psychotherapy practitioner at the moment, the requirement for everyone to do research. On the one hand, that's a fantastic idea because it gives everyone the opportunity to do some research. But what happens is an awful lot of time is spent producing research that just stays in somebody's dissertation on their cupboard, doesn't create a huge amount of impact. Whereas people working together, if we could overcome some of these multiple separate streams of research and pull them together, we might create more flow of knowledge. Collegiality.
Just to add, I think Nicola raises such an important point there about most really high quality research today is done in teams, large groups. Most of my publications now have 6-7 people more on them. There tends to be, I think the tradition again in counselling where people do research is often small scale, very local, isolated projects. And often, I don't know, there's often a culture with students who feeling when they're doing research, they've got to find something really original. They're really anxious that, that somebody else has done what they're doing and they're trying to find something that's far away from everybody else. Whereas in the research world, what happens is much more about building on and working with and developing projects in association with others. People like, colleagues of ours like Mari Thurston, who have worked, for instance, on counselling around sight loss, and where they've had a particular focus and they've drawn other people in to help them explore the experience and the effectiveness from different angles. And I think that's what we really need in the counselling field, is for people to identify particular areas in counselling for sight loss, counselling for dementia, particular approaches, particular methods, and to have teams of people, which might include students as well, working together on particular questions. That's where we're most likely to generate knowledge, whilst it's small scale individual activity. Something that we did after having done this big trial of school counselling is we had a big data set of episode sessions of counselling that then some students were coming in, obviously bearing in mind confidentiality, were then analysing. And we had some great projects. We had a great project with one student who coded all the sessions in terms of the depth of emotional processing. And because we had all the quant data on outcomes, could show that the best predictor, one of the best predictive outcomes, was how deeply emotionally the young people in the counselling were processing their emotions. And they worked with us and we published it. And that was a way of kind of drawing together student work with academic work to develop as a team knowledge generation, but it's just not done in individual silos anymore.
Oh, yeah, that's a change. I mean, it goes against almost the way we do counselling, which is typically individualized in the room by ourselves with the client, and almost we have to work outside of that when in the research space is do sort of more small groups, small research teams or join other teams which are already doing it perhaps.
And I think teams which are focused on a question, I think sometimes when people work in the counselling research, they can get focused on the methods. And I think there are some really interesting methods, but ultimately it's about having a question and answering a question. I think people are genuinely interested in a question like, how do we help people with sight loss in the best way that we can as counsellors? That's where you get some really innovative and exciting research, where it's not getting caught up in the methods per se, but the methods become a tool to genuinely find something out.
Absolutely.
I think my addition to there as well would be that in every other discipline of research, kind of people collectivize. If you look at cancer research, you have specialists in particular areas. We're a bunch of rural farmers where we have lots of individuals doing individual kind of pieces of work. And yeah, maybe, I suppose in relation to your question, maybe it's about training the trainers to understand some of that landscape. I think BACP did a good job a few years ago at trying to sort of distribute information to trainers to sort of support them in becoming upskilled in some ways in research so that they could guide the field a bit more. That seems to have ebbed a bit now, and I think it needs a bit of a refresher even. I wonder what's going to happen with AI, kind of like we talk about us in our own little silos working kind of with the kind of everyone having, person-centered VCBT and et cetera, is, well, there's this whole new kid on the block, the kind of, character.ai, this sort of very rudimentary online psychologist was used 194 million times already, kind of, and this is a very simple tool. And you think, well, actually, maybe the threats from outside of these new technologies might actually bring us together. I put that in just to be a little bit provocative.
Yeah, I know we've got a researcher on here tonight who's on a project in AI and counselling. I won't mention her name, but so it's something, a space which is not just the potential threat version of it, but there's also how it can assist us in our research and in data collection and all sorts of things, analysis and all sorts of opportunities there that we might have, as well as obviously we can see the AI counsellors as a threat, or we can see it as another resource for clients that they can access 24 hours a day. So I guess there's all these potential, this whole shift of technology coming into us, and what are we going to do with that? It becomes a question for us as a field. So look, anyone else thought of any questions?
Yes, I'd like to come in because I'm really inspired to sort of hear what Terry and Mick and Nicola are saying. But I'm at Western Sydney University, and the capacity to do research is really limited, and how to gather groups together and do it. I'm wondering how you manage to find the time, because I've got 20% at the moment to do my research, but most of that gets eaten up by something else. And I'm working individually with students and supervising them, but to gather a group together, and how do you do that? And find the time, and I don't care about the money, particularly myself, and I care about the profession, but how do you guys manage it?
Nicola, you've got your hand up to respond.
Yeah, I jumped straight in because this speaks to one of my passions in research, which is co-production. I think we're all trying to do work as individuals, and we just don't have capacities in academic settings to do that. But what we don't have yet is a culture of co-producing with practitioners in the field. We end up doing all of the work ourselves, but actually there's no route in for practitioners in the field who are expert practitioners, master practitioners, often because that's all they've done is focus on practice. And I think that we urgently in academia need a culture shift towards co-producing and linking research that happens in the academy with practice that happens outside in the field. And that will reduce workloads, I think, for researchers when we can do that, when we've got really good links with organizations and individuals who've got fantastic ideas, but they have no way to carry that out. Partly that is farming labor out into the outside, but it's providing people with opportunities to feed in. You look skeptical, Penelope.
Yes, it's only because loads of my students are out there working in the world, and they don't have time either, because they're seeing 5 clients a day, 5 days a week, and they're passionate too. But how do we? How have you done it? I love the ideas. I'm sorry to stir you all up, but
no, I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it points to the problem of coloniality, right? If we come back to that, we're seen as individual people achieving individual things, an individual course, an individual practitioner, we don't see ourselves as collectives. We don't see ourselves as collectives that share resources and are generous with each other and receive from each other. And that's the central problem that leads to burnout, I think, in situations like that, is that we're all individually pushing our own stone up a hill rather than working together to do it. So I'm not saying that in this cultural setting it's easy, very easy to do, but it would take a pedagogical revolution to be able to do it, and it would take a revolution within academia to do it, or we do that outside of academia. But I think one of the problems is the way that we're streamlined into these individual driven, performance driven requirements, capitalistic requirements, just actually crushes this kind of collective working together solidarity.
And I see, Mick, you've got your hand up to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Nicola, ethically, morally, kind of politically. Just in terms, I mean, what I see in the academic field is that some people do go down a research route and most people don't, and it's a kind of it's a pathways that are often decided quite early on in people's careers. I do a lot of mentoring, and often working with younger academics is it's decisions about, are they going to go down a research route or are they going to go down more of a practitioner teaching route. And I think if you go down a research route, and this is the opposite of what Nicola is saying, and I do agree with everything Nicola is saying, but and it is maybe within the context of everything she's talking about. The ones who go down the research route have to be fiercely protective of, say, that 20% that you're talking about. They just don't compromise it. They just say, right, Monday and Tuesday, I'm doing my research. People email me. I'm not going to respond because I'm focused on my research. And they clear the time to put in the bids, to get the research grants, which hopefully buys them out. And then it becomes a kind of virtuous cycle. And I think there's probably also something about in the counselling field that, because we care passionately about our students, because somebody comes to us and is really upset, we don't want to be saying, sorry, I'm doing my research. We put the relationships often first. But I think there's a certain I wouldn't say callousness, but there's a real kind of holding those boundaries. It is just so key to make it happen, because it's so easy for that time to get swamped. And I think once it gets swamped, then it becomes more and more difficult to go back into a research position and to get back engaged in research. And then, easily as an academic, as a trainer, you can spend your life doing teaching and not doing any research and losing that. So I think that's the reality.
I agree with that, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Mick. And I'm just noticing time now. And I guess probably one of my responses to Penny's question is around something which we're looking at. We've started to discuss forming a new network for counselling academics in Australia. And like, I know for me, I'm now working on several projects with people from other institutions as well as my own. And just because through the networks and relationships I've built over time. And so when I hear they're doing something, I might say, can I join you? Or if I'm doing something I think they might, then I say, hey, would you be interested? And so getting some good response. And I know Katrina's also got a research committee going as well, which invites students and counselling researchers and lecturers to come and join. And out of that, they might develop some projects that they work on, and that's all cross-institutional. And so that's I think there's ways that we can create some structures to help provide for those people who are academics who are wanting to research, but they just don't feel they've got the support or the connections within their institution to do so.
And I think, Nathan, that people in the UK, I mean, there's three of us here, but there's a lot of people in the UK, like John McLeod, colleagues at the BAC, who'd be really interested in, collaborating, talking further, looking at what you're doing and learning from what you're doing, as well as inputting, because collaboration, going back to what Nicola was saying, of course, that can happen across boundaries and borders, and it does happen a lot across borders. And in the world today, a lot of international projects. So there are things that we can do together. We can all work together on particular projects. So it would be great to keep in touch and to kind of keep these lines of communication open. to find out more about what you're doing, and to think about ways that we could link up.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. No, look, that's a great idea. And I think and certainly we've got connections also in the States, and we've got some key people in Australia who come from the States who've got connection there. So, and as well as other international regions as well. So, that's, again, it's the, being able to build relationships and connect in and identify opportunities and reach out to other researchers who are doing stuff that you're interested in, or invite them into teams that you might be leading. So absolutely. Look, I'm just mindful of time, so I just want to thank you, Mick and Terry and Nicola, for making time on a Saturday morning, is it, or a Friday morning? Friday morning, just before going to work, to come and talk to us Aussies down under. And share what you've been doing, and certainly I know the research subcommittee, as we've been preparing articles and that, we've been coming across your articles and thinking, yeah, there's some really good ideas here, and it's been really nice to hear you talk about it and flesh some of those out, add some additional ones, talk about some of the challenges as well, and a lot of the stuff you've talked about, particularly the challenges. I can say, yep, this feels like I'm hearing about Australia now, and I know this is not just counselling here, it's also counselling internationally, as well as practitioners internationally too, because they've had these discussions in psychology as well with the practice versus research, practitioner versus researchers sort of thing. So they're not new conversations, but it's around how do we actually do it within our context and within our area.
Well, it's been lovely for you to invite us in, and really appreciate it. And I really appreciate Terry and Nicola coming along and sharing their thoughts as well, and getting to see you all. And so maybe we'll come down under one day, come and see you all again. I was there a while back, but it'd be lovely to link up.